You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
My God, it's full of stars.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it?
You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
There is a greater darkness than the one we fight. It is we know only that it is always born in pain.
This is a special edition of Schrodinger's Diary with Anthony Peake and Miguel Conner. We have the pleasure of having as a guest Bill Murtha to discuss near-death experiences based on his book Dying for a Change. Thank you very much for joining us, Bill.
No, it's good to be here. Thank you, Miguel.
So before we start, why don't we go to you, Anthony? And in your research, what happens, and this, of course, involving your hypothesis of the Daemon and cheating the ferryman, what happens right before we die?
Well, what I suggest is, from the neurological evidence, that in times of extreme stress, and I can't think of a circumstance more stressful than dying, particularly under the circumstances that Bill will be explaining later, where you actually know that death is inevitable and is going to be taking place at some time in your future, in your immediate future. What tends to happen is that the brain, there's particular neurochemicals in the brain called neurotransmitters, and there's one particular neurotransmitter which is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain called glutamate. Now, glutamate, it is known, brings about certain changes of mental state when it floods the brain. And it is also known that glutamate does actually flood the brain at the times of stress and such like. For instance, many of your listeners out there will probably recognize the fact that sometimes when you're given extremely bad news, time seems to slow down. Sometimes when you are involved in a car crash or an accident, you have this sensation of time slowing down. This is the glutamate, and it's the glutamate that's facilitating your ability to deal with the problems that you have. Now, when somebody goes into a near-death experience, the glutamate brings about quite a few changes. Not only does time start to dilate, but also you start getting flashbacks to your previous life, the life you've just lived. It's something called a panoramic life review. Now, this may consist of either literally flashing through your life in a series of either images or like a continual stream of images that run in front of your eyes. Some people actually say they live their whole life again in a split second. Other individuals say that they have flashbacks to certain significant times in their life where they relive times in their own past. Also, another known effect is something called the appreciation or the perception of something called the being of light. Now, what the being of light is I suggest, is what I call your Daemon, your own higher self. And this manifests itself in the final moments of life. Sometimes it will manifest itself as a religious figure. Sometimes it will manifest itself as a dead relative. Or in certain cases, particularly in the cases of children who have near-death experiences, it's actually a friend who is still alive, or even a cartoon character. In fact, I have come across cases where people have seen Elvis Presley as being the being of light. So clearly this, whatever this is, it seems to be a manifestation of your own subconscious. Therefore, I suggest that certain individuals do go through these events. But the wonderful thing, well, not the wonderful thing, because what happened to Bill wasn't wonderful, it was life-changing, is that he went through a series of experiences that very much support in so many ways my cheating the ferryman hypothesis. And what I'd like to do now is to ask Bill if he could take us through a little bit about his background and then take us through the events of that cool April day in Dawlish in Devon. So, Bill, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and what happened that day?
Yeah, I mean, we're going back. I'm going to take you back now to 1999. I mean, I was caught up. I was an international executive for a big multinational company, you know, £100 million company. And my job was to travel across Europe a lot. And, you know, like a lot of people, I was only in my mid-30s. I'd climbed up the ladder quite quickly, and I had a very stressful job. And what I used to do to de-stress, close to where I live in Devon on the coast in the western part of Britain, to de-stress, I would go along with my push bike in an evening when I was at home, which wasn't very often. And just to sort of really, for that hour, just to empty out all the rubbish from my head for the day. And I'd always feel, you know, like a lot of us walking out and about and in nature, I'd feel 10 times better. But on this one particular day, the weather was changing, and I'm pedaling along frantically on my bike, and a freak wave come over and knocked me straight off the bike, and I tumbled down 20 feet into the sea and almost missed the rocks. The water was freezing cold. And I actually came up from the water and punched, you know, I sort of punched the air in elation because I'd missed the rocks and, you know, survived. And it just suddenly dawned on me, the water's freezing cold, it's getting dark, there's a 20-foot high algae-covered wall looking at me, and the waves are pounding me against it. And, you know, I'm thinking I've got to sort my stuff out quickly and decide what I'm going to do. Otherwise, I'm gone within a few minutes. So, you know, I frantically sort of used all my energy to kick away from the wall and sort of started to swim away. But by, you know, very quickly, I mean, this is April, it's you know, it's pretty cold. It's had a winter of bad weather, and, you know, very quickly the hypothermia starts to kick in, and, you know, I'm starting to suffer. My bones are aching, and all my body's starting to, I can really feel all my organs are starting to ache, and I know that's getting serious. And and with it very quickly, within 10, 15 minutes, I started to drift in and out of consciousness. Then I started to start experiencing this strange phenomena. I knew at the point it was getting serious because, well, I mean, the whole thing was serious, but I knew it was getting particularly serious when, you know, the pain, which was basically hypothermia, is like somebody drilling into your bones. I mean, the hypothermia started to subside, and I actually started to feel really warm, and I started to feel really good. And that's at the point where I thought, whoa, this, you know, I'm beginning to, you know, I'm knocking on the door now. And that's when I started to panic a bit. And I can just remember relaxing into it and looking up, and I looked up at a seagull on the beachhead, which was about sort of 100 yards away. By now I'd sort of, the tide had gripped me and it was getting dark and I'd starting to pull me out, but I could still just about make out this seagull, and it took off. And I can just remember the bizarre feeling of having an out-of-body experience as if I was that seagull. I know it sounds absolutely incredible, and it did at the time, and it still amazes me today, but it's as if I was looking at the world from the seagull and looking down on myself. And then I can remember changing attention and looking at something else. I looked towards the sea, looked towards the sun over the sea, and then suddenly I was out of that sort of perception of living the world and seeing it through a seagull, and then I was sort of the water, and I was bizarre. It was just this weird, bizarre mix of senses beginning to blend. You know, I just started to settle into this and realised that, you know, I was a goner, really. The minute I started to relax, I sort of closed my eyes, and then I started to, I didn't start. The first image I got, I'm 11 years old, and I'm running down the hill in London where I lived at the time. I go to cross the road, and a car comes across, almost hits me side on. I go absolutely sprawling. A part of my consciousness realizes that although I'm in the water, I'm back there actually reliving an experience as an 11-year-old when I got knocked down by a car. And for a moment, I'm thinking that I've died and everything's black, and then I suddenly sort of wake up, or my eyes open, and there's a great big ring of eyes and people's heads looking at me, and I realise that I've lived. And it was as if I relived that actual experience, feeling for feeling, only this time it was more intense. And then that image just suddenly disappeared. And the next thing, I'm looking at my hands, and I'm actually, I'm driving a car, and I look at my nails are all painted, and I suddenly realise I'm the woman in the car that actually crashed into me, but I'm now seeing the world from her perspective. And I can see myself as the 11-year-old boy in front of me, and I see the fear on my face as the woman in the car drive into me. I crash into the side, I open the door, I collapse, I can look at all my tights, I look down and all my tights are ripped, I stumble over to the boy, which is bizarrely myself, and I look and I think I've killed him, and I start crying, I crumble, and the whole thing, it was just bizarre. I'm reliving the whole experience, but this time from a different level of consciousness. I'm seeing it from her view, and I'm actually feeling what she's going through, the emotions, the fear, the anxiety. I can feel it in my heart. And then I won't go too much into it, but I had several more what I call, life review. I didn't have a full life review. In a way, I felt a bit cheated, but I had sort of these sporadic moments which I now look back and reflect on as the most intensely emotional, both good and bad. That's what I seem to have the experience of. It was reliving these whole things again.
Did you feel, Bill, that there's one thing that is talked about a lot is something called the oceanic sensation, which is an irony, seeing as you were actually in the sea at the time. But the people like Who Leaps as an example, people like, who am I thinking of now? The Akashic field, people like Irvin Laszlo. And Laszlo suggests that there's this field of information that under certain circumstances we can tap into, where we become part of a greater whole. It's as if we realize that all life is one and is unified. Because I've always been intrigued by your comments about your relationship with the seagull. It always intrigues me that as to why you felt that. And then seeing the viewpoint from two different people. So indeed, at that point, your consciousness was probably in three places, wasn't it? It was in the mind of the woman. You were probably still the young boy, and you were Bill dying in the sea. It's quite incredible stuff, isn't it?
Even now, 10 years plus on, it still amazes me. I sort of question it. Because it's the sort of thing that we can occasionally, if we get very high and we get elation and we get this feeling of community, if we're in a crowd, we feel as if we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Imagine that, and 10 times more intense. That's what I felt, in the water, because as the seagull and looking at the sun, suddenly I felt as if I was the sun. And that feeling of being just a molecule really, or an atom as part of a greater fabric, is amazing, because it's as if the boundary between you, Bill, Murtha, the identity, the separate identity, suddenly blends with everything else, and you realize that somehow on a web of connection that you're all linked.
This is interesting, because I was talking to somebody recently who is a very deep practitioner of meditation. And one of the things she was explaining to me was that, when you're meditating very effectively, because the barriers of your body cease, and you start to move out from your body into a wider encompassing, it's as if you become bigger and wider and start to suck everything into yourself, and you almost feel like you're the world and the universe. And clearly from your experience, this seems to be, if your experience is not unique, and from my reading, it certainly seems that it isn't, it's something that we all have. Now, religious individuals right through history, Jacob Boehme, who Miguel will know about, who was a great Gnostic thinker during the Reformation, very much used to come to this conclusion, that the idea that everything is enfolded within itself. William Blake, to see heaven in a wild flower. It's again the sensations that you had, that people of the Gnostic tradition have argued for many, many years. But clearly it is something that's ingrained in all of us. But what I'm intrigued about, Bill, was when you were in the water as well, you seem to be given an opportunity to see an alternative future as well. It's suggesting that there were very much alternatives available to you at that time, and futures that could exist and could come into existence, or futures that may not come into existence. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the, at the end of the, what I call the reliving, my past, similar to the car accident. There was another time that I relived, which was a dream that I had when I was 11 years old again. I mean, what that car accident seemed to do to me at the time as an 11-year-old living in London, I can remember the next day coming out of hospital and something had shifted, because I had this, and I didn't really understand it as an 11-year-old, but I had this perception increase, this awareness. I didn't really understand it or frame it. I just knew something was different. And within a few days of that accident, I had a dream, and that dream was a football match, and I dreamt the right score for my father, who was an alcoholic. He put all the money that the house had for food on the for the week on this result, and he won an absolute packet of money, much to disgust of my mother. But that experience was relived again in the water, and at the end of several other events, I had this experience where I was in the hallway. I was in the hallway of where I lived at the time in 1999 as an executive, and I'm at the back of the hall, and I can't see my body, but I look towards the front door. My wife is stood there with my two children, one either side of her, and there's a knock on the door. And the police, she opens the door, and there's a policewoman and a policeman stood there. And my children and my wife are crying, and I can feel this very heavy, somber, dark feeling. And they say, the man speaks and says, Mrs. Murtha, I'm sorry to inform you, we've found your husband's body on Teignmouth Beach, which is 5 miles up the coast from where we lived and where I went in the water. And he said, obviously, we need you to come down and identify it. And, I am sorry, but... and anyway, at that very moment, it suddenly hit me, in this presence, in this sort of other consciousness, while I'm in the water, but viewing this as well, it suddenly hit me, oh my God, I've died. After all of this has gone on, this is now me having died. And it just suddenly came down on me like a great big hard dark energy. And it was a mixture of fear and mixture of sadness, but also a release. There was a bizarre, weird set of positive and negative emotions all mixed in. But then suddenly, in the click of a finger, I suddenly had this awareness that no, this is not an actual experience. This is a possibility. For some reason, I just felt, no, this is not my time. I mean, I didn't have the tunnel, the much vaunted experience of being in a tunnel and experiencing that. I didn't have that. But I suppose in a way, this long hallway was my tunnel. And I just remember thinking, no, I've got too much to live for. And the very split second that I made a conscious decision not to die, and I really truly believe I did have that decision to make, and I was in control of it, absolutely, without question. The minute I made that decision, whoosh, the image of the hallway, my wife and children, the police, disappeared, and then suddenly I'm back in the water. And I'm conscious that it's dark, I'm freezing, my body's shaking. It's as if all the pain suddenly, whoosh, went straight back into me.
That's intriguing in itself, isn't it? Because effectively one would argue that when you first started having the experience, the feel-good drugs were kicking in, the endorphins, to actually make you feel warmer and everything else. Then the glutamate starts to hit and time starts to slow down. You get the past life experiences and everything. But effectively then something else seems to happen within the brain. And it's something that we will be discussing later. But one of the books that you're working on at the moment is a book called Visionaries, one book that's recently been published under with your editorial nous and everything. And in that book, one of the contributors is Stuart Hamerhoff. Now, Dr. Hamerhoff is an anesthesiologist down at the University of Colorado. And Stuart has an idea that, within the deep structures of the brain, called microtubules, we can access the quantum level of existence. And one of the major areas of quantum physics is something called the many worlds interpretation of particle physics. suggested by a guy called Hugh Everett III in 1957 as part of his PhD thesis. Now, I won't go into the details about this, but at some stage, maybe in a future program, I will. But clearly, one of the things is the idea that there are multiple universes out there, and every potential possibility does actually take place, and a version of you will experience all of these things. So clearly there are alternative lives that versions of you will live. And I would suggest that probably you had a glimpse, an out-of-the-body experience, and the glimpse of seeing an alternate future where you had died. Now, I'm very much interested in your description there, because I'm at the moment halfway through writing my third book on, funnily enough, out-of-the-body experiences. And it's very pertinent what you said there, that you couldn't, when you were in the hallway, you were at a point, presumably looking down at the people, but you did not have a body. It's
that's right.
So you felt that you were just a point of intelligence or a point of consciousness.
Yeah. I'm just I'm there as an observer, and I naturally seem to have a decision in the whole process, but for some reason I'm sort of almost stepped out of it as well, if that makes sense.
Again, it's kind of a duality thing, isn't it? You know, that your fraction, your personality is breaking up into these subcomponent parts that are observing different things at the same time. But do you know how long you'd been in the water by this stage? Because clearly a lot had happened, but do you know roughly how long you'd been in the water by this stage?
I mean, in total, I think by the time I get pulled out, it was about 2 hours. So, I mean, after 10, 15 minutes in freezing cold waters, as most people know, your body is starting to shut down already. And of course, the brain being the most protected organ in the body is the last to go. And what I was fearful of in the water is that, I could feel this intense pain on my kidneys, on my heart, and I'm thinking I'm going to live through all this pain. And that was the worst thing.
And Bill, I can ask you, through this experience of you breaking down and seeing different parts and alternative worlds, perhaps the Daemon speaking to you, were there any solid messages, or was it all simply imagery? Anything speaking to you, saying you should have done this or you should do this?
I mean, this is the fascinating part, which Anthony knows about. 3/4 of my book, Dying for a Change, which goes around the whole subject. 3/4 of the book, which I haven't even mentioned yet, is about this incredible conversation I had with what I can only describe as a third, as a presence. At the very point that I'd had the reruns, and then thinking that, I've died, I then enter into this two-way conversation where, bizarrely, every question that I'd ever asked about life just came at me. I mean, bearing in mind, I say only 2 hours, this conversation seemed to go on for weeks, because as the book shows, I asked a lot of questions, particularly what happened to me as an 11-year-old and what it had inspired in me. And there was some shift, I started to become a lot more psychic, a lot more intuitive, a lot more aware of things around me. So and I'd always sort of been really intrigued by that. And that started me off on a quest, I suppose, at about 15, 16 years old, to try and make sense of it all. And of course, there was a lot of unanswered questions, of which I really went in with this conversation.
So how did it start? I mean, effectively, you're now back in your body again. You're floating in the water. And then suddenly the being that I would call the Daemon, and anybody that knows my hypothesis, what I suggest is that at the point of death, we effectively split into two personalities. The Daemon, which is your higher self, and the Eidolon, which is your everyday self. So this kind of dialogue could start at that stage. But did the voice, firstly, was it a voice that you could hear, or was it an inner dialogue, is my first question. And what did the voice sound like?
Well, probably both.
Right.
It wasn't outside of me and it wasn't inside of me, but it was both, if you know what I mean. And I can remember being in this sort of what I can only describe as a semi-conscious state, And I can remember forcing my hands together, and I was, bearing in mind I was an atheist at the time. You know, I was so anti-religion, anti-spirituality. You know, I was probably the most left-brained person you could ever come across as a 34-year-old at the time. But I can remember doing something instinctively, almost like it's embedded in your genes. I actually started to pray, and I managed to force my hands together. And I just prayed with all my heart and soul for forgiveness, for the things I'd done against my family, for not being the father I could have been. And I can remember just thinking, I think the words I actually used were, God, forgive me. I was sobbing at the time. And I was saying to words to the effect of, forgive me for not being the husband or father I should have been. Forgive me for taking my life for granted. And I just remember feeling this intense self-loathing, you know, as I was sort of in this semi-state. And I was really genuinely ready to die. And this voice just punctured through in the most sweet, calm, compassionate way. And I just remember it absolutely word for word. And it came across as, in your heart, do you honestly and truthfully imagine your life to have been a complete failure? And I remember my mind just stopping, because I think, you know, I just remember thinking this was not my inner dialogue. It was a slightly different voice, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't my thoughts. That's what was more bizarre.
What was the voice, male or female?
Male.
And this was its opening statement to you, which is an amazingly precise and profound thing. But you can imagine the shock. There you are, thinking you're going to die, and then suddenly there's this voice that's you and is not you, that's not part of your inner dialogue. And I think that's a very profound statement, isn't it? You know, we have inner dialogues all the time. We have inner discussions with ourselves, but we almost know the answers. Whereas this kind of dialogue is something with a being that you can't anticipate what it's going to say next, and seems to know wisdom that you have not got. So what did it start to talk about then, and how did just give us a snippet of the things you talked about?
Well, I mean, I remember, and I talked about my mind stopping. It almost felt that my mind did stop. You know, my mind, as in Bill Murtha, my history, my thoughts and feelings. It was as if they were suspended, and that, you know, that crisscross of thoughts, you know, that fast track of thoughts that roll across our mind constantly every few seconds. It's as if that was suspended to let this voice come through. And I remember it was just, I knew it wasn't my thoughts, my voice, my words, my feelings, but it was controlled, it was authoritative, it was loving, it was fleeting. And it was almost as if the words were whispered, as if spoken inside my head. I was so petrified by this, even though I was in this semi-conscious state, which I was getting to a place of calm and acceptance that I was dying or close to death. I just remember closing my eyes and I tried to ignore the voice. I almost didn't want it to go there. And I remember the voice came through again, and it repeated, and it said, I'll repeat what I've already said. Do you truthfully imagine that your life has been a complete failure? And do you really feel in your heart of hearts, in the depth of your soul, that your time on earth has been wasted? And this time the voice was louder, it was more urgent, and it seemed to be spoken from every single part of me, every cell, and not just my head. And then before I had even time to reply, I did. I almost shocked myself, because I replied. And I remember saying, yes, as a matter of fact, I do. And I said it in a really angry sort of, you know, why am I in this situation, close to death way? And then this conversation just said, please think again and change your mind, for I tell you these absolute truths. No one person's life is ever wasted. No one person's life is ever deemed a failure, regardless of how long a lifetime is lived. And I remember it just came across as, you know, this voice, it just said, if a human soul incarnates for but 1 hour, then its life has brought a profound meaning to the world. I mean, it was incredible. Wow. And then the dialogue started. You know, as the book demonstrates, we just got into this two-way dialogue where all my questions were answered.
And Bill, after you survived this ordeal, when did you begin soaking in that you'd gone through? When do you realize that you were transformed, that it was time for you to take a different alternative path in your life?
I wish
you needed, or you just reflected upon it through time?
Oh, I wish I could have said the next week, but it took me an agonizing 18 months to...
Had to let go of all the material attachments, huh?
Even though these incredible things can happen to us, Miguel, you know, there's a part of us that's ingrained, particularly with our upbringing and you know, the way, you know, that dogmatic sort of status quo where we don't want to accept it, even if we've had an incredible experience. My left brain, my stupidity, was saying, no, I'm not going to get this out. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I didn't want to think about it. The minute thoughts came in, that was it. I even went back to work, bearing in mind my chairman, you know, said I could have a couple of weeks, couple of months off, you know, to repair, because I had broken ribs. I was, you know, I needed counselling. I was so fixed on getting back to work in a few days because it meant that I could get right back into my old world. I wouldn't have to think about it. I wouldn't have to reflect on it. And this happened for 18 months. And what started to steadily happen was that my drug problem started to get worse, my drink problem, my overwork. Because what I was trying to do is shut those feelings and reflections and thoughts out. And it did start to work at the beginning. But steadily, you know, as these things creep up on you, I was having to take more drugs, more drink to shut this inner dialogue voice out that was telling me to reflect on it, learn from it, share it. I just couldn't. And then I had this incredible experience I was away in Amsterdam, and I took 2 carfuls of clients, my top clients abroad, for a weekend, long weekend. And we'd been out all weekend and drinking and you know, using all sorts of drugs. And at the very end, on the Sunday night, we're sat in this basement bar in Amsterdam, and this voice, this same voice, similar to the one in the water, came and punched through. And I remember it was as sweet and compassionate as ever. And it just came through and said, Bill, what are you doing with your life? This is not who you are or where you're meant to be. And as drunk and sort of semi-conscious as I was, it was as if you pushed a button, because in that very second after that voice, I just seemed to sober up. And it was as if the light bulb suddenly went up, and I suddenly realized that I'm wasting my life. I'm killing myself. I survived this incredible ordeal. I've not shared it, and yet I'm not even reflecting on it or trying to go there. And it was at that very moment that I suddenly decided to change.
I mean, every time I hear that story, it amazes me, because, you know, it is the idea that even though the daemon has become manifest in your life, even though after your events your daemon is there to guide you and knows that the path you're on is not necessarily the right one, we ignore it. As you say, you know, we say that this can't be real. The reality is the reality of earning a living. The reality is doing the mundane things. And Bill and I have discussed this many times when we've met, the idea of following your muse, following the things that you really need to do. And sometimes you feel this, that you're on the wrong path, but you don't know how to get back on it. Your daemon is just trying to pull you back to it. And clearly, this is what happened to Bill in the water and subsequent to that. But the interesting thing is, what then happened to Bill after? Did the voice then leave you? Because what I'd like to do is to now move on to the amazing set of circumstances in which you are here today to tell us about these amazing events. But did the voice say, right, I'm now leaving you, or did it fade away, or what then happened?
I can remember, it's almost as if, trying to think back now, I mean, it's almost as if every question that I'd ever asked of life had been answered. And then I just remember getting to a point of thinking this immense feeling of gratitude, you know, of love and compassion that had been shared with me. And, you know, I thanked this presence for this incredible journey. And I felt as if my life was suddenly deeper and richer and more full, and I felt that I'd made a real friendship. And I can remember, I'll read just a couple of lines actually. I mean, I remember the last words came in from the presence were, "No thanks are necessary," it said. "If you do wish to thank anyone, then thank yourself. And if you want to thank life, then it is simple. Go out and let your living experience be an example of your highest truth, and give thanks that your curiosity has brought you to this wonderful place in your life. Give gratitude that you have the presence of mind to see where you have gone so drastically off course. And then I remember answering, but I haven't found the answers. You did. You gave them to me. And the voice come back with, no, it was you, my beloved friend, who discovered your own treasure. You revealed your greatest hidden secrets. Every answer that you ever need is always there waiting for you. Please remember that. And all you ever need do is go within. That is where your salvation will be found. And that, I remember that last sentence as if it's embedded into my psyche and my body. You know, this is where your salvation will be found. And it was just incredible. I can remember, I can even feel it now, the welling up, you know, in my heart or wherever my heart was at the time. You know, I just remember thinking, wow, this is just, you know, incredible.
The words are incredibly powerful, aren't they? You know, that as Miguel would say, and I'm sure that Miguel is probably thinking this now, that in Gnostic terminology is the concept of Sophia, which is wisdom. And clearly the words that this being is talking to you are incredibly beautiful and words that probably, you know, anybody that knew you would know that you're very verbally good and everything else. But these words are different. They're poetic. It's not just normal talk, is it? It's something that you almost find in a lot of the received texts of religious bodies and everything else. You know, that, you know, they have a great resonance to them and a great import.
I think as well, you know, not only the wisdom and the insights that came through were clearly not mine. They're not what I'd learned in my life up to 34 years. But some of the words that had been used were often words that I'd never, you know, we've got our own dictionary, if you call it, that we use in our life, don't we? And I just know that there was lots of words in there that I didn't really understand the true meaning to, or I'd never used before. That was the most bizarre thing for me.
Again, it's if it's a revelation, you know, literally the terms of revelation, that there is something opening up within your own psyche that is attuning you to something much greater than yourself and is mixing you. Now, interestingly enough, a few weeks ago, Miguel and I interviewed Tessa Dick, the widow of the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
Now, if you read particularly the excerpts from his exegesis, and you read a lot of his own personal writings and the stuff he put in his novels Valis, you will discover that, rather in a similar way, he said that there was this being that manifested itself and talked to him and told him what he should do and what he shouldn't do, and guided him in a very, very similar way. There are many, many parallels to what happened to you in the water, that what happened to Philip K. Dick in March of 1974 when he had his theophany. And I think that, again, you know, there's this resonance of Gnostic teaching in these kind of things. So the voice then gives this fantastically powerful speech, then disappears, and then you're alone again in the sea.
Yeah, and you know, I'm at that point where, you know, it's dark, I'm freezing cold, I'm sort of, although my body's being pounded, you know, there's an inner calmness suddenly come into me. And I can remember looking up, you know, 100 odd yards in the distance, and there was this window. It was a top floor window, and there was a small, tiny, I could barely make out that, you know, whether it was a female or male, but I remember looking at this shadow in the window, and I'd done something I'd never done before in my life, and I just started to pray furiously. Now, this is an atheist. This is someone who'd never, you know, had any time for the church, for spirituality, for anything outside of the physical realm. And it was almost instinctual. You know, I started to pray furiously. And I remember the words in my mind saying, I just wish you could see me. I just really wish this person could see me. And a couple of moments later, well, I don't know, I'm losing time by this, you know, this point, and I'm really sort of in and out of consciousness. But I started to hear a voice, and I thought it was in my head. And I dared to open an eye, and there on the quayside was a guy waving to me. And I can always remember his first words, because bearing in mind I'm sort of, close to death, his voice just punched through to me, and he said, "Do you want help?" and I can remember it's the best thing he could ever say to me, because I remember thinking, I want to survive, I want to get out, and I want to punch this guy. I want to just, because what does he think I'm doing out here in the dark, freezing cold water? Anyway, to cut a long story short, they fired one of these orange boys out. By now there's a crowd beginning to build. He'd obviously called people, and they fired an orange boy out to me, and my hands were were so riddled with hypothermia that I couldn't even grab the boy or the rope. And, the crowd is sort of shouting and screaming for me to pull it. And it's like a hot knife going through butter. I just couldn't grip it. And, I'm thinking, I can't believe I'm this close, and I'm going to be, and I'm going to die right on the very edge of being saved. And this is where another bizarre thing came in, because this voice came into my head, the same voice as in Amsterdam bar, same voice that I'd had a two-way conversation with. And this voice told me to look for the trailing rope. And I thought, this is bizarre, and I couldn't see anything. And I looked again, and at the end of this bullet-shaped orange buoy was about 3 foot of rope, which was like a noose. And it was incredible. And what I did in the end, I put the noose around my body, and what they managed to do was pull me in. And that's where I smashed up all my ribs on the rocks. And then they rushed me to hospital, and, they managed to sort of bring my core body temperature up overnight and with injections. And, and the next morning I sort of, I lived to tell the tale.
But the interesting thing, isn't it, Bill, is the final ending of the story of why it was that the man at the window saw you.
I mean, this is the thing that really blew me out of the way at the time, as if there weren't enough elements in the story anyway. But at the time, I was a semi-professional footballer. The matron came in the morning, bearing in mind that I've just sort of narrowly missed death. And the matron was really agitated. And she said, there's a damn reporter downstairs from the local newspaper, and he won't go away. And I thought, I said, look, I don't mind going to see him for 10 minutes. Look, I can hobble, or you can push me in a chair. It's not something that is I'm worried about. And anyway, I went to see this reporter, and no, he didn't want anything to do with the football that was going on. We were playing very well at the time. We were close to a couple of big finals at Wembley, and so anyway, he said, no, do you know anything about the telescope? And I said, what telescope? And he said, have you not heard? He said, there's a guy down on the front where you were rescued from last night. He's now being interviewed by a couple of radio stations. There's a couple of national newspapers there. They're talking to him about the telescope. And I thought, oh my God, and anyway, this reporter didn't know the full story, but he told me that basically this guy had spotted me with a telescope. The next couple of days when I sort of got home, I wanted to really contact this guy called Nathan Swindlehurst. I mean, he'd spotted me. He'd obviously raised the alarm. I really wanted to thank him. I mean, how do you thank someone who's saved your life? But I needed this, compulsion to go and meet him. Anyway, he came round my house, and he basically said, look, I need to have some time alone with you. The whole thing's really shocked me and freaked me out. And I said, well, what way? And he said, the funny thing is, on the very day that we were rescued, he said, I'd been saying to my friend in the flat underneath me for 9 months to bring that telescope round. And he said it was one of these things that he was saying, right, I'll bring it round next week, the week after. Anyway, on the very afternoon of the evening I went in the water, Nathan's friend from the flat below brought the telescope round. And he set the telescope up because it was going to be a full moon that night. And he went away to make a drink, came back, and the telescope had dropped. And he thought, that's a bit strange. I'm sure I'd done the telescope up properly. Anyway, and this is another bizarre thing. Nathan had this compulsion in him to look through the telescope. Now, there was nothing to look at. It was dark. There was a shimmer, obviously, of the moonlight on the sea, but there was nothing to look at. What he said what he said to me is he should have just realigned it, fixed it back up to look at the moon and carried on. But he said he had this compulsion to look through the telescope. And at the very point that he looked through the telescope, that's where he spotted me in the water.
That every time you tell that, Bill, it amazes me. It is as if, your daemon had been manifesting itself within you all that time. And then suddenly, this other guy's daemon suddenly makes him do something subliminally that effectively saved your life. Because if he'd not done that, you would have died, wouldn't you?
Well, there was no way anyone else was spotting me in that water because, and I mean, the whole thing, I can remember, when you get that whole shudder down the back of your neck and all the hairs stand up. And when he told me about the telescope and then told me about the chance of him actually getting the telescope and the dropping of it down, I mean, God, how many billions to one chance is that?
So what do you make of that, Miguel?
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Definitely very fated. And after your experience when you finally accepted that you needed to live a worthy life, what happened? Did you write your book? And what else did you do? What really changed within you in your life?
Lots
Left
of
your
things.
job, the usual stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'd suddenly woke up to the fact that I needed a meaningful job, that I needed to get out of the lifestyle that I was. I can remember that journey back from Amsterdam on the plane because my best friend, who had come across Europe with me everywhere, he could sense there was something different in me. I was very quiet. And when I got back, I decided, and I can remember within a few weeks, I just started to write. And it was as if there was a dam burst, longhand. I mean, I'd never written anything. I was chronically dyslexic, chronically dyspraxic. The worst thing that I have felt, I've had a phenomenal experience. What the hell do I do with it? Because, I was such a bad writer. My personal secretary would even write a two-lined invitation to a client because I couldn't even put that together. What my biggest fear was that I'd had this incredible conversation, this incredible experience, unbelievable, and yet I wouldn't be able to articulate it and get it out there. So I just started to write down longhand, and I didn't stop writing. And, some days I'd be writing 40, I had a long day at work, and then 12 o'clock when the family all went to bed, I'd be up till 4 o'clock in the morning sometimes because it's as if the dam burst suddenly, happened and I'm having to write it out. And I'd wake, I'd go to bed exhausted for 3 hours and my hand was aching and I'd written 50 A4 pages of longhand. I managed to thankfully find a professional writing tutor that worked with me for 4 years and helped me to adapt and to learn the skills. And, it was painstaking work because at the same time I was working as well. And we just gradually managed to then start working on the book. And, with all the love and compassion, my great friend today, a top writing tutor called Katie Clark, she helped me to just chisel my skills and to start looking at this story because that's another great synchronicity if you call it. I mean, if the wrong writing tutor would have got hold of this and I wouldn't have felt comfortable with them, there's no way I could have talked to them about the conversation or the feelings that were going on in the water or the out of body experiences, because it just wouldn't. And yet it was one of those situations where you meet someone in life for the first time, and I remember from the first 5 minutes that this would be the teacher for me. And what's happened over the last few years, the book has now come out last year, Dying for a Change, under Transformation Media Books in California. I then, incredibly, a few years ago, I had another dream where, because of the interest that Anthony and me both share with trying to interview and study and research and talk to these pioneers from the quantum physics field and the new consciousness studies sector and research establishment, the SMN and ions and all the rest, because of the interest, I decided to go out and interview over a 4-year period 200 change makers, luminaries, people at the forefront of change in science and medicine and spirituality and religion. And obviously, Tony, Anthony Peake as well. He's in the book. He was one of the first persons that I come across and I interviewed, and he's in the book as well. So the book's just come out a few weeks ago, and it's called 100 Words, 200 Visionaries Share Their Hope for the Future.
All right, well, I think that's it, unless you have anything else, Anthony.
No, all I'd like to do is to very much thank Bill for coming on, and actually to say to people out there that Bill's book is simply wonderful. Bill honoured me by giving me the opportunity to read the manuscript, and I read it in about 2 days, and it was incredibly moving, and just a wonderful, wonderful book, and it deserves to be hugely successful, because Bill is such a genuine guy who had an extraordinary experience. And it is both Bill and I, it is our intention, if there's any interest parties out there, we've already done 2 lectures, because we're both members of the Scientific and Medical Network and the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And we've both done these 2 interviews whereby Bill does a morning session and I do an afternoon session. And it works just wonderfully. The reactions we've had have been absolutely phenomenal, because Bill's story is intensely human. And that's the thing that comes across, is just how powerfully human Bill's story is. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. And then I come along with the more colder, rational approach to it all. But effectively, as Bill says, we meet in the middle and we create something very, very powerful. And all I can say is that if anybody's interested in reading Bill's book, really, really do get a hold of it. It's well worth a read. And thank you, Miguel, again for yet another wonderful Schrodinger's diary.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Miguel. That's I've really enjoyed it, and just same for you, really, Anthony. I mean, what your books, particularly Daemon, and more so Cheat the Ferryman, really gave me was I know your hypothesis, and explanation really helped me to start to learn the framework and make sense of my experiences, because we can have these experiences, but when someone then backs it up with the science or the hypothesis, leaning with the science and explanations, and it just makes you think, great, you're not going mad, happened to you is real. And I think that's what helps a lot of people, is to get to that understanding.
Yeah, I just hope that all of us, we're all searchers and we're all trying to find an understanding of exactly what this is all about. And I think at the moment we're all involved in something that is of profound importance. And I think, as you said earlier, we are being pulled together by something greater than ourselves. Synchronicity, synchronidity, as we call it on my forum. But there is something very, very powerful going on. Miguel and I will both use the term, it's an egregore.
I am stretched on your grave and will lie there forever, with your hands held in